where I direct the Paul and Marcia Center of Contemporary China. Today, I have the privilege of introducing our first speaker for the semester, Susan Fiske. I came to Princeton in 2015. Susan actually was one of the few Princeton-based scholars I had known before that. Before I met Susan, as a scholar and student of social equality and social stratification, I always thought high social status was a good thing. I was wrong. After I met Susan, then I learned that social status could be a source of trouble, envy. That it's a strong and common emotion that Susan has studied and shown to us. So if you cannot remember anything she's going to talk today, remember she has established the common reaction to success, envy. Watch out for your own fate. Sometimes you will encounter, if you are successful, you will encounter envy sooner or later. Susan has been well recognized by the field of psychology. She has won many, many awards. I went to the website, there are just too many for me to enumerate here. Among the most important ones, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and National Academy of Sciences. By one estimation, this is a favorite of the website of Wikipedia. By some estimation, she is the 22nd most eminent modern psychologist ever. 12th, the most eminent living psychologist today. And the second most eminent living women psychologist today. So it's a pretty high ranking she's there in the field of psychology. Today we are fortunate to have Susan to give the lecture. Please join me in welcoming Susan.
Thanks, Marcia. The solution I've found to the envy problem is when people say, where do you live? I don't say Princeton. I also don't say New Jersey because then they feel sorry for me. So then what I say instead is I live outside New York, which is sufficiently vague. But I'll come back to that actually as a contrast. So I'm particularly honored to be here because I'm not an expert in China, but I'm very interested in China. And so I'm happy to share the kind of data we've been collecting that's relevant to China. And I did first go to China in college, and now have been there lately because we have collaborators, and also my son is there, so it's a good reason to go, besides. What I'm going to talk about today is some data about China situated in a broader framework that we've been working on ever since I got to Princeton 2 decades ago. You'll see that, well, I'll let it speak for itself. So the work that we do on stereotypes has been under the rubric of a framework called the stereotype content model. And the problem that we're dealing with is how people deal with immigration and globalization in the modern world, which creates diversity, which in the face of people's preferences for homophily and homogeneity and stability, it's incompatible to have to deal with diversity. And so it's kind of a shock to the psychological system to have all these different people around. It's not what people are used to, and the question is, how do people cope? And I hope by the end of this I'll have a cheerful, optimistic message for you about that. But what psychologists have been saying for the last couple decades is they take a cognitive approach to this issue and talk about how people stereotype other people in order to cope with diversity. You can't make sense of every single person you encounter in any kind of detail, and so people categorize other people and then have automatic reactions associated with that. What we've done is find that there are a knowable number of dimensions that seem to be pretty consistent that help understand how people sort other people and make sense of them. So in order to navigate the social world, the first thing you need to know is other people's intentions toward you. That's why the sentry calls out in the night, halt, who goes there, friend or foe. You want to know the other's intent, and that's the specific thing about other people that is special. We call that having a warm or cold intent, and that's our first dimension. The second thing you need to know about other people is, can they act on their intent? And we call that competence. So this is really simple, but it turns out to be like one of those simple things that you can hit everything and it works. So this warmth by competence space, I hope I'll convince you by the end, is a useful tool that you can use for things too. The stereotype content model evidence comes from surveys, experiments, and natural language processing that I'm going to be talking about today. Because it's so basic, we spent some time looking at neural signatures of it. I'm not going to talk about that data today. But these dimensions and the evidence for them suggest universality. Now, I'm a social scientist, psychological scientist. I realize how stupid it is to say universal. You're just begging people to come and attack you. And they did, and we'll talk about it. But I'm convinced just because it keeps being useful all over the place, all over the world, over time levels. What I'm going to talk about in general, once I introduce the model, is how the shape of this space responds to social structure. And echoing the title, the maps that we make tell the hopeful shape of things to come, how people cope with diversity. So this work was started originally here at Princeton with Amy Cuddy and Peter Glick at Lawrence University, and Jun Zhu. So here's the basic model. If you look at, in terms of quadrants, the high part of the space, the high warmth, high competence part of the space, are groups that people consider to be their in-group, their allies, their reference groups, and people express pride in these groups. So in the United States, the middle class would be in the high part of the space. They're trustworthy, and they're competent. The direct contrast to that is the low part of the space. Poor people, homeless people, often immigrants. People express disgust toward these groups. And the sort of uncanny thing is all over the world, the groups that don't have an address land in this part of the space. So migrants, refugees, homeless people, Roma, nomads, Bedouin, they're all, when you look at the different cultures' descriptions of their groups, these people without an address end up in the low part of the space. And so we could talk about why that is. I'd like to get your thoughts about that. So this much, the high and the low are a direct contrast to each other. You could get that from any kind of classic in-group, out-group literature. What we've added, because of our two dimensions, are the ambivalent parts of the space. So all over the world, older people and people with disabilities are seen as well-intentioned but inept and useless. And people express pity toward them. So pity is an ambivalent emotion because it says, I'd like to help you and I feel sorry for you, but only as long as you stay subordinate to me. So I don't know about you, I don't want to be pitied anytime soon. That's why I don't say New Jersey. And on the other hand, the rich and the professionals and the Ivy League people are envied. And that's a dangerous place to be too, because people see you as highly competent but not very nice. And they resent you. And, you know, carrying that resentment around is a bad place to be too. So this is it. You can go home now. I'm going to show you that this comes back over and over again and why it's useful. So you're scientists, let me tell you the method. The canonical survey that we do is so simple and so cheap. Please don't tell anybody I'm asking for money, how cheap it is. So you get one group of people to nominate their society's groups. We just say, who do people talk about as groups in society? And it gets translated and back translated, and the sort of rule of thumb is if 15% or more of the sample mention the group, it's probably in common discourse. Then in phase 2, we get individual people to rate we usually get from most countries between 16 and 30 groups that people talk about. And they can't rate all 30 of them because otherwise their eyes glaze over. But if you get them to rate about half of that, that works. We asked them to rate the groups in the way society views them. We started doing that because we were thinking that people would not admit to having stereotypes. But we discovered that what we were doing is building a cultural map that everybody agrees is this is how societies view these groups. So the first dimension we ask people about is how warm, how friendly, how trustworthy are they according to people in society, and then we ask how capable and assertive. So in this, the reason it's cheap is because the group is the unit of analysis in this work. So all you need is a stable estimate, an agreement by the people answering the survey about how this group is viewed. It doesn't take very many people to get that. You don't need thousands. And so we plot the means in a warmth by competence space. We do cluster analysis to see what hangs together. So here's an example. Here's an American example. Can you read this from the back there? Yeah, okay. So in the high part of the space, you see reference groups like women and Christians, middle class, whites, blue collar, men, Catholics. So in American society, these are often seen as stable reference groups. In the low part of the space, you have poor people. It doesn't incidentally matter what race they are. Poor black people, poor white people end up in the same spot. Teenagers, this is a new phenomenon actually for us. As a parent, I can understand why teenagers might seem like they've gone over to the other side. But notice that children are in the top left part of the space, in the pity quadrant. So children are seen as well-intentioned but incompetent, and then they become teenagers, and they're bad, and they become adults. So children, old people, gays, Hispanics, young people, liberals, those are all seen as sort of pitiful. And then the groups that are seen as enviable, competent, but not so warm include rich people all over the world. That's a totally reliable result. Everybody thinks rich people are competent but cold. And in the US at this time, Asians and Jews and white-collar people in general. And if you did Ivy League professors, that's where we would be. The groups that are in the sort of middle, lower middle, blacks, conservatives, atheists, and Muslims are either there because there are subtypes that people are collapsing across. So we know that about black Americans, that it depends on social class, where they land. We also have a study of subtype of Muslims, and people differentiate. But anyway, this gives you a sense of what it looks like. If you ask people what emotions these groups elicit, these are the emotions in the corners are the ones that are the highest for those quadrants. So especially for this audience, I'll show you the Chinese data. Bai can answer all your questions about it. So you see children and rural residents, students and adolescents, and to some extent disabled and poor people are all in the kind of pity-ish area of the space. It's really bad to be unemployed, according to the people answering this in China. Rich people, you can see, are in the envy quadrant, so are businessmen, doctors, white-collar employees. So it's very similar to what you see in the American case. Special to China are that migrant workers are seen as a reference group, and workers in general, and women, and intellectuals, and blue-collar people. We do have a collection of data from former communist countries, and workers are often seen to be in the high part of the space, which is not true of countries that have not been under communism. So that may be part of the explanation for the sort of admiration for the migrant workers and workers in general. So, you know, it's food for thought to look at this. Anyway, by now we've done nearly 50 countries. And so we find that the dimensions meet the eyeball test. That is, they spread the groups out across the space in ways that make sense to people who know the place. And this is just a map of where we've been and the people who've made it possible. So this is where we started to get a little arrogant, you know, a little too self-confident maybe. But, you know, it works over different kinds of samples, convenience samples, online samples, representative sample surveys, they all come up with the same thing. You see that it works in different countries. We even have comparative data over time. So content analysis of fascist magazines from Italy in the 30s generated our space, separate from us. And then the very first stereotyping study was done at Princeton in 1933, and then periodic intervals after that, using the same paradigm and the same national and ethnic groups. And you can recode their 84 adjectives on the checklist to warmth and competence, and you know, you get the space and the groups end up in the same part of the space. I can tell you about it if you ask any questions. We've also looked at subtypes, as I mentioned. Some of the groups appear to be not thought of in sort of big macro level, but more at the subtype level. So, you know, this is convincing to us. The mechanism of trying to infer the other's intent seems to be robust. So who else has intentions besides people? Animals. So who's like us? In the US at least, our dogs and cats and horses and monkeys and elephants are pretty smart, so they go up there too. Who are the predators who are coldly competent? Leopards, lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. Who's disgusting? Lizards, vermin, snakes, ew. And then the pathetic ones, it turns out, are the ones we eat. So you can think of them as prey. So, yeah, it makes some sense. Besides animals, who else has intentions? Well, corporations are people too, right? So I had a marketing guy, branding guy get in touch and say, we can apply this. So all American brands, Campbell's, Johnson & Johnson, Hershey's, Coca-Cola, you know, they're good, solid American things. Then there are the troubled brands, AIG, BP, Goldman Sachs, Marlboro. And the luxury brands are called the competent. And then I'm sorry to say that the government-sponsored brands are pitiful, which, as a progressive person, makes me sad. But, and my colleague would want me to tell you that there's a book about this. Okay, so what we've done is, in terms of contribution to the stereotyping literature in psychology, is gone beyond valence, that is, beyond simply positive and negative judgments to make it more nuanced. And we've shown this with multiple methods, as I mentioned. So, you know, as I was saying, we were getting pretty confident, but not so fast. Along came some challengers, and we were nervous at first, but then there was a lot of mutual respect, and we decided to engage in adversarial collaboration. So I'd like to mention that briefly to you. So the challenges they were first bringing up were, maybe it's not just two dimensions, because we went in with a theory, and people didn't have a chance to say anything else. So one person said, your two dimensions are necessary, all the people care about is the virtue and morality of their groups. And somebody else said, you've left out ideology, that's important, and then other people said you should break it down into more detail. And you know, it's true that we selected the dimensions from theory. We had a functional approach. What do you need to know about other people in order to interact with them? And it's clear that people can and do use these dimensions. And it's been validated by various tests of the causal model, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. But we thought it was a good idea to take these challenges on because what we discovered was we all were on a panel together, all the competing people, and people came up to us afterwards and said, what do I do? You've got 5 different models. What do I use? And then I was afraid, what I foresaw was people would give up. that the whole field would say, forget that stuff's too complicated and confusing. So we started to collaborate with various people in these, and I'll show you one. But first, within the stereotype content camp, we decided to take seriously the problem that we had not allowed people to speak in their own words, because we'd supplied them with closed-ended scales. So we have engaged, again, if you have any questions, Bai will answer it. But Gandalf Nicholas was the lead on this. So we looked to see what people said about groups if you didn't tell them what to do. So we had several studies about this. One is some studies of spontaneously generating labels to group names and using natural language processing to analyze the content. And I'm full of admiration for Gandalf and Bai because they've just mastered these techniques in ways that are beyond me. But, we decided also to expand the number of groups that we would have people react to, so it wasn't curated by us in advance. And the result is that we've come up with, I say we advisedly, we've come up with 13 dictionaries that together account for 87% of the open-ended responses that people have when they're describing groups. Among the most frequent dictionaries are ability and agency, which sound like competence, morality and sociability, which are facets of warmth, and then some miscellaneous things that are kind of ideology, beliefs in politics and religion, and status. I don't expect you to do all the calculations, so I've done it for you. Basically what it adds up to is a third, and then miscellaneous. So competence and warmth emerge from these open-ended responses that people have. So that's reassuring. The other thing we've done is allow people to ask for information. We want to know which dimensions people use when, because we don't doubt these other people's models. Sometimes people do want to know beliefs and ideology. Sometimes they do want to know more about morality. And we think that our particular approach reflects how people deal with people they're expecting to encounter, people in the neighborhood. And the rival theory, in particular, the ABC model represented by this guy, Alex Koch, is more sort of sociological and analytical, and it's like you're at 30,000 feet looking down on a society trying to figure it out. So our prediction is that warmth will be the most important thing because you need to know people's intentions, but that's not necessarily theirs. So what we found, again with online adults, we've manipulated the perspective. What do you want to know about a new group arriving in your nation or your neighborhood? Then we realized that was mostly sounded like immigrants. So then we said, okay, you're moving to a new neighborhood or nation. And then we realized that that's not perfect either, so we said, okay, make a relational judgment or make a societal judgment. And the dependent variables were the importance of obtaining information so we did it 5 different ways, basically to convince the reviewers, rating of dimensions, open-ended, self-coded, dictionary-coded, explain why. So we tried to do everything possible to be as open to things that people would say. So here, to give you some flavor, if you're moving to a new nation, what do you want to know? Language, food, jobs, cost of living, are they friendly and tolerant, are they happy and secure? Neighborhood is a little more about yourself, quiet, safe, clean, friendly. Can I earn money? I don't want them to rob me. Do they have a disease? I hope they're not perverts or criminals. And this is my favorite. So, they're doing a different analysis. And what you see in general with the neighborhood or with the relational goals is much more emphasis on sociality. What you see with the structural analysis is much more emphasis on beliefs and status in general. So you're getting basically the same dimensions but different emphases. So the bottom line is, from the spontaneous dimensions, warmth is always high, especially sociability if it's relational. Morality is almost always high. And beliefs come up mostly when people are doing kind of structural analysis. And in the spontaneous descriptions, warmth and competence win over the other ones. So we're back to feeling arrogant. But there's not a total consensus, and what we've decided to do with these other 5 folks is do an adversarial alignment of our theories. So we locked ourselves in a hotel room in Amsterdam and said, let's write a paper together. And we came out not killing each other. So part of the reason for this is that if you look seriously at the literature in social psychology, these 2 dimensions have come up ever since Solomon Asch in 1946. And so part of me says people have had to invent these dimensions over time, so it must be necessary to explain how people think about other people. But in the modern era, in this adversarial synthesis, are Andrea Abele, Naomi Ellemers, Alex Koch, and Vincent Iserbyt. And after 7 days in Amsterdam, we were able to agree that there's a kind of horizontal dimension, which is about your relationship on a sort of peer-to-peer basis, and a kind of vertical dimension, which is about status and hierarchy. So that's pretty good. But we're back to work. And we're putting in for money to do sort of key experiments to deal with controversy. So if I talk to you again in 5 years, I might know more. So now I'm going to change gears a bit, and this is stuff that starts with, well, you'll see, but what I'm going to argue is from a meta point of view. So if you think about the stereotype content maps, we have enough of them now that we see sometimes they go stretch this way, sometimes they have a hole in them, sometimes they clump up. And it turns out that these are all predicted by structural variables and that they're psychologically meaningful. So when I talk about the shape of stereotype content, that's what I mean. I'm going to talk about in-groups, ambivalence, and dispersion as a function of societal factors. And I think this is where we're going to end up feeling cheerful at the end. So first of all, I'm going to show you 4 East Asian maps. And on the first 3, I just want you to squint and say, what's the pattern? Okay, so here's Hong Kong. What's missing? The in-group. Here's South Korea. What's missing? In-group. Here's Japan. What's missing? The in-group. So these are data that are not recent. They're probably 15 years old. But what was surprising to us in seeing these 3 data sets, if you take the Japanese example, the groups that in our previous Western European and American data that would have been in the high part of the space, like full members of society, students, my hometown, my family, Japanese people, instead of being, we're the greatest, we're kind of, well, we're okay. But the other groups were still in the same place that they're in everywhere else. So homeless people are low, professionals are where they usually are, children and old people. So from a theoretical point of view, this means that you don't have to have in-group love to have out-group dislike, which for social psychologists is interesting information. Apart from the Hong Kong data, which are quite old, we didn't have data from China, mainland China at that point. What you see if you look at more recent data from China is something that looks more like the European and American data, which is groups in all 4 quadrants. In the in-group, you have intellectuals, entrepreneurs, men, teachers, scientists, students. Those are the admired groups, according to this. So what this does is say, you can look at patterns of these once you have enough of these maps and sort of squint and see if you can see things going on. So that was based on an N of 3 countries plus China, before. So that's not too strong, but this is more robust. So one of the things that we saw, if you look at the maps, the ambivalent quadrants, so in South Africa, the Xhosa, the Zulus, the Muslims are in the envy quadrant, and in the pity quadrant you see domestic workers and old people. But then we began to get maps that looked more like this. And at first, like a good scientist, I was in denial and pretended they weren't there. But then at some point I realized we had to deal with this. And so we realized that the simple way to quantify this is the correlation between warmth and competence. So normally we think of it as being about 0, but then in a few places it was definitely not 0. So Federica Durante and I, with at that point, 3 dozen national samples, calculated the average warmth competence correlation to be 0.4, but so some ambivalence, but the range was huge. And so that begs for an explanation. And so, you know, in South Africa you have high ambivalence, in the French Swiss and other Swiss cantons you have low ambivalence. So what's going on? Well, it turns out it has a very neat and tidy explanation. Ambivalence correlates with inequality. So the warmth competence correlation correlates with the Gini coefficient. Who knew? The reason that we think it does is that when you have a lot of income inequality, you have a lot of explaining to do. So there are deserving poor people and undeserving poor people. There are deserving rich people and undeserving rich people. So, you know, if you're unhappy with the status system, sorry about that, I'm going to complicate it so much it's hard to protest. On the other hand, if you have a big social safety net, like the Swiss and the Scandinavians, then you say, most of us are in the in-group. There are a few people that we don't tolerate too well, the refugees, the Muslims, the Roma, but everybody else, they fold the old people into the main vector. The rich people, not so much, but almost everybody else in the ambivalent parts of the space get folded into the main vector. So what you see are the 2 countries I gave as examples, but they have a whole bunch of other countries around them. And like I said, the correlation is around -34. And it's robust to various kinds of controls. So, you know, the shape of the space tells you something potentially descriptively about the culture. And now here are data that are hot off the press or not even off the press yet. I'm going to talk about dispersion. So the dispersion work comes in part from our thinking about immigrants and how countries assimilate immigrants. So this was a stereotype content map we did of immigrants in American society, and then some sort of anchor groups like old people and homeless people and rich people. So in this, if you look at, it's probably hard to see, but in the lower right corner, immigrants include Asians, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, and they're in the same places as tech industry professionals and rich people. So they're reporting that Americans think about Asian immigrants that way. They're also reporting that Americans think about undocumented immigrants as low, first generation African immigrants, Mexican immigrants, Latinos, and South Americans. So apart from the Asian immigrants, these are people of color. If they think about European immigrants, they're in the same cluster with Americans and third generation immigrants and Canadians, who we think are better than us. You know, people have a stereotype of Canadians that's quite wrong. They think of Canada as being all white and you know, guys on horses with funny hats. So part of what's interesting to me about this map is that the first generation immigrants are in the low quadrant, but the third generation immigrants are in the high quadrant. So it suggests that people are able to report that when people are third generation, they're just like us. So this is the first sign of maybe some kind of reason for optimism. So how do people become us? I opened up by saying that diversity is threatening. There's recent data from Jen Richardson and others saying when you tell people that the United States is going to become more and more diverse, they get conservative and nervous and unpleasant. And Bob Putnam has talked about the lived reality of a diverse neighborhood and basically made it out to be a pretty terrible place to be. But then there's a whole literature about contact, which improves attitudes. Intergroup contact under all ports conditions, depending on who you talk to. Most people think that it is a good thing, and the meta-analyses that Pettigrew has done at least suggest that it has a good effect on intergroup attitudes. But the question we're wondering is, there are so many conditions on contact. How can it be that that is what accounts for the third generation effect? And so we're wondering whether other kinds of contact and other kinds of mechanisms might matter. So we were thinking that active contact may not be necessary, maybe even passive contact works pretty well. Mere exposure to other people on the street and on the subway, habituation. You know, you're riding the subway and people are coming on the subway wearing funny clothes, and at first it makes you nervous, but then after a while nothing ever happens. And so you get used to the people in the funny clothes. Let me give you an intuitive example for this. So here are stereotype content maps for 4 American states. Notice how Maine is all spread out and Wyoming is all spread out. But Hawaii and New York are all clumped up. And if you think about where the in-group quadrant is, that means in Hawaii and New York, everybody's in the in-group quadrant. How weird is that? Well, if you think about the setting, Maine and Wyoming are among the least diverse states in the country, and Hawaii and New York are among the most diverse, right? So, when it's more diverse, what happens? You bump into people. You see them on the subway, you see them on the beach. You get used to them because you have to. You don't have all the all-port conditions. It might be faster if you did. So, Bai and Miguel Ramos and I, but really Bai and Miguel, developed a project to pursue this hunch. And there's a kind of a paradox, which is the more diverse the setting, the less dispersed the map. So it's sort of opposite to what your hunch might be. So, we have data from 46 countries, and we could look at ethnic diversity using the Herfindahl index, which is the probability that 2 randomly chosen individuals belong to different groups. We can look at dispersion and the warmth by competence space by looking at the sum of the Euclidean distances from each group to the centroid, standardized. So we have 2 quantitative measures of these 2 things. And in the country data, just as a sort of easy thing to look at, the Pearson correlation is -0.366. And you can control for the Gini coefficient, the mix of groups. Might be stronger if it's just ethnicity, but here's a picture of what it looks like. Lebanon is an example of a more dispersed one, and South Africa is more clumped up. We also looked at it at the level of 50 U.S. states. We looked at immigrant diversity for each state based on the top 20 groups of immigrants, or top 20 groups of the U.S. Census. And we did a survey and got people's subjective sense of diversity as well. So the state could could be estimated by the dispersion by the warmth and competence maps for 30 raters per state, so it was manageable. And again, you get an adequate correlation of negative 0.38. And it holds controlling for Gini and GDP, and without Hawaii, which is kind of an outlier on diversity. So if you think about it, you know, the sort of Hawaiian philosophy of aloha, we're all Hawaiians, even though we're so different looking and multicultural. And in New York, too, in a different way, people say, we're all New Yorkers. So it works also at the individual level. So individual level perceived diversity is associated with individual stereotype dispersion. And decreased dispersion aligns with life satisfaction. So the more clumped up the groups are in the high part of the space usually, the better people's life satisfaction is. I'm not going to say it's causal, but I'd like to. So we also have individual longitudinal data, thanks to Douglas Massey. The NLSF, some of you may know about it, looked at 28 selective schools and had 1,000 whites, 1,000 blacks, 1,000 Asians, 1,000 Hispanics. Yeah, thank you. You can read it while I'm coughing. So the schools differed in diversity. We used the Herfindahl index. So we had data from we could reinterpret as the warmth and competence ratings of these four ethnicities in the freshman wave and in their senior year.
This is college. Schools are colleges.
Colleges and universities. For those of you who don't know, I'm married. And I married him because he has wonderful data. I'm a big fan of his data. So luckily, in the first wave, they asked the students about diversity in their high school, and in the last wave in college, they asked them about perceived ethnic diversity also. So we have both cobbled together dispersion and cobbled together diversity data. And what you see is awfully close, well, all right, I won't say the word causality. But, so if you look at the triangles, these are, in the left-hand column, it's high school at wave 1, and then the triangle kids move to a more diverse college. And their dispersion is shrinking as they do that. Whereas the students who moved to a less or equally diverse college stay more or less flat. So, kudos to Bai and to Miguel, you know. 3 different levels of analysis, 3 different data sets, and pretty much the same things going on in all 3 of them. So, we're calling it a diversity paradox because I actually predicted the opposite. I was totally wrong. It's always good to be wrong. More diversity, less dispersion. And at least in one case, more well-being. So to me, this is optimistic. It answers some of the critics of diversity who say, you know, that there's tension when there's no diversity but people consider it, and no tension with established diversity is what we want to argue. So this is a way to describe the psychological mechanism at the cognitive level of macro level diversity and perceived diversity and well-being. So it just happens that Miguel and Doug have looked at people getting used to diversity over time. And what you find The vertical axis is quality of life, and the horizontal one is degree of diversity, and they have data that they analyzed from the World Values Survey, the European Social Survey, and the Latino Barometer. And what you find is that people get used to diversity over time. At first, thank you, saved me. So at first, diversity makes people, it gives a diversity dip in well-being, but if the place has been diverse for a while, then people's subjective well-being is back. So they have on a macro level where we have evidence of some potential psychological mechanisms for it at the micro level. So ending on that cheerful note, there's the lab from actually year before last, and I thank you for turning on listening.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Yes.
So this isn't on your main theme of diversity, but the 3 East Asian figures you showed, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, the absence or the odd placement of the high circle is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear your thoughts or speculative interpretations. It's interesting to me, who does nothing in this area whatsoever, but does work with a lot of self-evaluative responses to questions. We always worry about self-rated health and how we compare the responses in East Asian countries with, say, the U.S. Marital quality is another one that is frequent in my work, where you don't have the extreme, well, of course you have, it's great, 10, 11, but that's very uncommon, and you have much more concentration in the middle. And I don't know if that has anything to do with this, but I'd like to hear what your
I think it does.
thoughts
So
are.
according to the cultural psychologists, everything's way more complicated. But let me start with a simple version of it from 15 years, 20 years ago. So people like Shinobu Kitayama and Hazel Marcus, pointed out that there's a huge bias in American social psychology because it's American and other things. And that a big piece of this was the focus on American independence and not taking account of interdependence. And so they carved a theory out about independent cells versus interdependent cells. And from that, they came to predict some of these things about sort of more modest, even neutral views of self and others. So, when you read this literature and you read the evidence, the picture that you get of Americans is of a sort of 3-year-old who's kind of, I'm the best, even when they can't do what they are claiming to do. So, we come across as a little bit immature and sort of, as compared to a more sort of mature and nuanced, well, I'm fine. Doesn't mean I like these other groups. Doesn't mean your marriage is better than my marriage. It's just fine. And it's a sort of lower risk thing to do, to rate yourself kind of okay. But so there's a bunch of cultural psychology evidence that's consistent with what you're talking about. And so when I saw those 3 data sets, I said, it makes total sense from that point of view. Yeah. But I do think that things change when society requires you to be more autonomous and entrepreneurial and less collectivist. And I think speculating as a total outsider, maybe that's what's going on in China. I don't know, but people have talked about that.
Let me follow up on the cultural difference thing that James started. I think another cultural difference between East Asians, Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese on one hand, American on the other hand, has to do with education, achievement, social status. I think many Asians, even Asian Americans, more likely to believe success is driven by education, or education is important to career success, whereas whites are less likely to believe in the link. And for that reason, you don't see, didn't see for Asian data, the intellectual scientists, highly educated, will be at the low, high, low, will be the envy group. They're more likely to be admired in the high end. And I think, so it is different. Even for entrepreneurs in Chinese data, you see them in the high end.
Yeah.
So I think in part because maybe it's a miss. I think Asians more likely to believe in the causal link between effort, education, and mindset, and through work, growth mindset, through hard work, and then to get achievement, career success. So that linkage is more visible, and more people believe in the link. And that part of the reason I think people with education, I believe, in China will not be envied. They will be admired in China. We could do experiment. Chinese Americans, I think Ivy League people, Doug and Susan will be highly admired in China instead of being envied in China. I
think we should test it, because
we do it next week.
The meritocracy
Yes.
belief is very strong all over the world. So the correlation between a group's perceived status, which is a structural variable, prestige, economic success, and the group's perceived competence, is 0.9. I mean, that's 0.8 or 0.9 is the average. And I couldn't get it to be lower anywhere, except, it turns out, in the former Soviet countries. So there, things, the correlation between status and merit kind of got messed up for a while.
But is it true?
But not in China.
In the high.
So when we did something for the NAS on science communicators, if scientists are seen as, in the United States, as scientists or researchers, we're a little cold. But if we're seen as professors or teachers, then we're in the high quadrant. So it's an empirical question. We should look at it. I mean, I think part of what you're saying makes sense to me, but I think also that people all over the world believe in meritocracy in a way I really couldn't believe. It's very hard to fudge that. Yeah. So we should see if we can make it.
We'll see. We need comparative data.
Yeah, we do.
We need data to.
Yeah, we do.
I do. In our work, we do find that Asian students and parents are more likely to believe in the importance of education than whites in the same school. So this is a fixed effect. So there are differences, and also family background effect on education expectation is very low in China. So it's an indirect evidence. I think we can test what I propose. I think Ivy League professors will be admired instead of being envied in China. And same with Peking University professor, even though they should be envied, but I don't think on the street they're not.
Yeah. Well, they may also be. Well, we can talk. Yeah. It's an empirical question.